Okay.
Do you want to talk and see if Kimberly can hear?
Yep. Kimberly, can you hear me? I know she came back. Just let me know if you can hear us now. But
I
yeah, I
can
just
hear
want to
you
go.
both.
You can. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I just want to go over the topics. So today we'll talk a little bit about biology, just honeybee biology, and that's mostly in the apprentice course, but I want to cover it briefly. Next week we'll cover just pesticides and varroa and disease management. We'll have Keegan. We'll talk about native pollinators and wasps. Then I'll talk about genetics, queen rearing and breeding, splitting and then diagnosing any queen issues. And then we'll be talking about extracting, bottling, and selling honey in the state of Texas, mentoring, communication, bee plants, and so on. I might add some of the apprentice level stuff, so I can kind of show you the apprentice level. So we just have time to talk about all of it. But yeah, these are really the topics we're covering in the apprentice level. And so, if you want to kind of watch recordings for the apprentice level, I'm happy to add you to the classroom to watch those recordings. I know, because of the program being new with us, that we're kind of working on, having this information for the apprentice level and then the more advanced stuff for the advanced level. But if you want to learn more about, getting started beekeeping, inspections, nutrition, feeding, pest pathogen ID, things like that. We can definitely add you to this classroom so you have access to that information, and you can watch all the videos. So just shoot us an email, me or Heather an email. We can add you to that Google Classroom so you can watch some of these recordings. Okay, perfect. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I will talk about, honeybee biology, behavior a little bit. Obviously, we will go in more in depth with apprentice level. So if you have any other questions or want really the full recording for the apprentice level, I'm happy to add you to that group so you can watch some of those recordings. So we'll talk a little bit about queen biology, drone biology, and then worker biology, and some of the behaviors that bees have. So first we'll talk about, honeybee colony. So when you think about honeybee colony, a colony means it's a group of bees that work together for the growth and survival of the entire colony. And a hive is basically where beekeepers manage the bees or where bees are naturally living in an environment. So like these boxes are known as a hive, but the colonies are actual bees inside the hive. So within a honeybee colony, we have these different castes. And so typically there's one queen within the colony. She's quite a bit larger than the rest of the bees. She has this large abdomen, which these large ovaries, and that allows the queen to lay somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day during the peak summer months. And so she's the only individual that can typically lay eggs within the colony. Now, some of you more experienced beekeepers may have seen multiple queens in the colony, but it's very, very rare. I've seen it a few times, but it doesn't last very long. The middle we have the drones. So drones are the males. They have these large eyes that allow them to navigate and find these mating areas with the queens. They have these huge thoraxes that are packed with flight muscles that allow them to traverse the weather and fly to these mating areas. And so the drones are really important for mating. They're kind of the mooches of the colony. They really depend on the workers for everything. They depend on the workers for nutrition, warmth, and food. But they have a really important role, and that is to, inseminate a queen and pass the genetics to future colonies. Drones are typically found in the colony in the middle of the summer, and so at the end of the summer, the bees typically evict the males and kill them off. And so if you do have colonies right now, you may see a few drones in your colony, but most of them have already been evicted probably around, November or so. The workers are also females, so workers and queens are both females, result of the fertilized eggs. But one reason that a bee becomes a worker is because they're food restricted during development, and so they develop specialized features that allow them to do kind of these non-reproductive tasks within the colony. So they have, these milk glands in their head that allow them to feed developing larvae. They have these, larger corbiculate legs, which allow them to collect pollen and resources for the colony. They have barbed stingers, so when they sting you, they die. So they have all these specialized features that aren't related to reproduction, but related to the survival and growth and protection of a colony. So colonies in bees like to have a certain organization. They're very structured in that way. And one way they structure colonies is by having eggs and brood in the middle of the frame. And so this is a frame from one of our bee colonies, and pardon the really spotty brood pattern. It's not the best colony, but it's one way that can kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So as you can see, we see a lot of capped brood, and if you look closer, there's eggs and larvae in the middle of the frame. On the outsides, we see all this coloration. So these are, bee bread or pollen that was collected and fermented. So there's a yellowish, orange, and purple colors. And the outside is the sugar or honey stores. And so that's typically how bees set up their colony. And as you add boxes, most of the brood will be in the bottom boxes, and they start storing some of the resources like pollen and nectar and honey into the top boxes. But typically, this is how bees structure a frame and structure a colony. So within a colony, and if you're starting a colony from scratch, and you're buying plastic foundation with the hexagonal indents, the bees will produce wax, manipulate that wax, and then build wax on those frames. And so as you can see, these are all the wax that was built by the bees. And as you can see, they're in these hexagonal shapes. And one reason for those hexagonal shapes is because it's a really great way for bees to store honey. So there's been some research showing that this is the most efficient and best way to store large amounts of honey is through this hexagonal shape. And so one reason they built it this way is because they can store as much honey, and the bees are able to hoard that honey for the winter. One also thing about this hexagonal shape is it's very strong and stable. So if you ever pull out a frame and try to push on the wax, like obviously you can push and break it, but it's actually very strong and allows it to stay resistant and stay stable for multiple years. And one reason for that is because there's these kind of wax columns at the points of the hexagonal cell, and that makes this cell as stable and persistent as possible. But also the way they structure these hexagonal cells, it allows for wax conservation. So because it takes a lot of resources and sugar for bees to produce wax, they try to conserve it as much as possible. So even though there's these kind of strong columns at the points, in the middle is a very thin layer of wax, and that allows the bees to conserve wax and use those resources for other things related to growth and survival of the colony. The wax also allows the bees to control the temperature. So bees are really great at controlling the temperature within a colony at 95 degrees, whether it's 120 degrees outside or whether it's negative 20. The bees can maintain a stable temperature of 95 degrees. And the wax allows them to actually do that. So wax is a really great way for bees to not only build a structure for storage, but also maintain temperature. It's also used for a lot of different reasons. So, as beekeepers, we think of, honey storage, but it's used for the developing brood and larva. It's used to store, pollen, and it's used for a lot of different reasons. So it's not used for one purpose, it's used for multiple purposes. Now, this was a recently drawn out wax frame. And so you can see it's this really yellowish, bright color, but over time, it'll turn kind of a darkish, brownish, darkish blackish color. And that really doesn't mean that the wax is any different. It just means that there's more traffic from the bees. So over time, it's kind of like you have a clean house. Like when you first buy a house and you put in new floors, it's really clean. But as you have a bunch of kids running around, spilling food everywhere, it just becomes dirtier and dirtier. And so that's one reason that this wax, becomes different color over time, just because of the pesticide residues or traffic from the bees. So what are the resources that honeybees need? So one of the major resources is pollen. So pollen is the protein source that the bees collect that's used for growth and development of larvae and the health of adult bees. And so protein has really all the pollen has all the protein that the bees need. It also includes antioxidants, antimicrobial products, and things that can keep the bees healthy and ability to resist some diseases. And so pollen is really their major protein source. Nectar is the sugar that the bees are collecting from the flowers. And so as bees are foraging and going to these different flower sources, they're sticking their long tongues or proboscis into the flowers, collecting that nectar, storing it into this organ called the honey stomach, and then processing it into honey. And so nectar is their major sugar source. Now, one reason that bees produce so much honey, and if you look at other, solitary bees, which we'll talk about, they produce some kind of honey-like substance, but bees, because they don't quite go through hibernation, they kind of go into this kind of warmth ball through the winter, these clusters through the winter. They need a lot of sugar to make it through the winter. So bees are really bred and adapted to hoard a lot of honey and then use that to keep them warm and keep them alive throughout the winter. Bees are also collecting water, so water is really important for ventilation and keeping the colony cool. So bees want to make sure that the temperature within the colony is at least 95 degrees, because if it's less than that or more than that, that can cause issues with brood development, that can cause issues with queen fertility, that can cause issues with colony growth. And so water is one way that the bees can keep the colony cool. And as you can imagine, we get some extremely hot and warm days here in Texas. And so one way bees deal with that is by collecting water to ventilate the colony. And then we have propolis. So propolis is produced from resin in trees, typically some of these poplar trees. So if you're in an area with a bunch of cottonwood trees, your bees are probably collecting resin from those trees and producing propolis. Propolis is important for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's used as a glue to keep the colony closed and close up any spots that's open to the outside air. And so bees want to sort of protect the colony from any, moisture coming in or any wind coming in, and propolis is one important part of that. The other important part of that is to use as sort of antimicrobial substance. So bees will kind of line certain areas of the colony, and that protects it from disease and other pathogens. And so propolis has a lot of really great antimicrobial properties, and it's used to keep the colony clean and disease free. Okay, so nectar. So when you're a beekeeper and you're pulling out a frame that looks like this, and you can see kind of the glistening in some of these cells, this is where bees are storing the nectar and processing it into, honey. And so as beekeepers, we call this ripening because the bees need to basically ripen that nectar into a substance that they can store for long periods of time. Because this nectar has a high water content, so it can mold, it can have diseases, and so one way they process this nectar is by adding enzymes and decreasing the moisture content so they can store this honey for longer periods of time. And that's one reason that honey is really shelf stable because the bees have processed that nectar. And so bees just stored nectar, that nectar would start having a lot of disease, a lot of fungal growth, a lot of different things with it. And so bees have to process it. So when bees are going out to flowers, they're sticking their proboscis into the flowers, collecting that nectar, and then they store it into this organ called the honey stomach. They fly back to the colony and they transfer that to different nestmates, and then they regurgitate it into these cells. Now, what they're doing with regurgitation is one, they're adding enzymes. So one of these enzymes actually makes hydrogen peroxide. And so if you ever use hydrogen peroxide for cleaning, it's a really great way to desanitize certain things. But bees are actually adding some of this hydrogen peroxide to the honey to keep the honey shelf stable. They also have enzymes that, you know, separate the sucrose into simple sugar molecules called glucose and fructose. And they're also adding enzymes to process the honey into a way that bees can process. They're also, using their wings to dehydrate the nectar into honey that has a lower, lower moisture content. Because the bees like to have the moisture content below 18%, so it can store and last longer on the shelves. And so bees do a really great job of processing the nectar into a source that lasts a long time for the bees. Second one is bee bread. So when bees are, going to a flower, either they're indirectly collecting the pollen, so as they're getting the nectar, their legs can stick in the pollen and collect it that way. Or some bees are actually, their only role is to go out and collect some of these pollen. And so as they come back, they have these kind of pollen on the back of their legs called the corbiculates, and they bring it back and they push it into some of these cells. Now, as they're putting these in cells, the bees want to process that pollen so it's more digestible to the bees. So what they're doing is they're adding, nectar, they're adding enzymes, they're adding yeast to really ferment that pollen into bee bread to make it more digestible to the bees. And so this bee bread is really this fermented processed pollen that's easier for the bees to consume and digest. It also contains a lot of beneficial microbes, and so if the bees have a really awesome microbiome and have a lot of great microbes in their guts, they can use that to help with the processing of the pollen and keep it lasting longer with all the nutrients. Another thing is propolis, and so a lot of you are had bees for at least 1 year, maybe a couple years or more, and bees being propolis. And as beekeepers, we hate dealing with propolis because it makes it really hard to open up the boxes, pull supers off. It can make it difficult to, pull the covers off. But for the bees, it's a really important substance. So, one, it performs as a glue to keep that cover stable and locked onto the colonies. So if there is a windstorm or a rainstorm, that cover doesn't automatically, blow off. But if there's any cracks or holes in the colony that's allowing moisture or anything getting into the colony, then that allows them to close that up to make sure that that temperature and the humidity stays stable within the colony. It also acts as a natural antibiotic, protecting the bees from diseases. So it has a lot of antimicrobial properties that can help the bees deal with some of these diseases. And so, as I'll talk about, later on, is honeybees have actually a very low immune system, and one way they make up for that is by using the social behaviors or social immunity, and then this propolis to protect the colony. Okay, so as beekeepers, we manage colonies in these hive boxes. And so this is what's known as a Langstroth colony. What that means is there's these stacks of boxes that have removable frames. And so I'd assume a majority of beekeepers on this call have these Langstroth colonies. Beekeepers also manage them in top bar colonies, flow hives, and some other types of colony configurations. But this is probably the most common. And for me, I typically keep our colonies in double brood boxes or double deep brood boxes. And so these deep boxes with about 10 removable frames. And this is where the queen's typically laying eggs and the brood is developing. And then as the season progresses, beekeepers will add these medium honey supers. There isn't a difference in how much the bees are storing in these medium honey supers. It just makes it easier for the beekeepers to pull out the supers, extract the honey, and then bottle that honey. So there really isn't a difference. The only difference is how big the frames actually are. But a lot of colonies live in these unmanaged or feral environments. And so I like to call them feral. You can call them unmanaged colonies, but basically these are colonies that are living in the natural environment that are unmanaged by beekeepers. And there's really three types of unmanaged colonies. The first type are these open air colonies. So this is a situation where a swarm of bees left a colony, went to a tree, and decided just to build a nest at that tree. And so, you can see all these combs kind of built in the tree. One issue with this for bees is it's unprotected by the environment. So you can see all the hexagonal cells and the wax exposed to the environment. And so this isn't really the best way for the bees to protect the wax. And so I don't see many open air colonies. I see a few here in East Texas. You guys have maybe dealt with a few open air colonies, but it's pretty rare because it's really hard for the bees to keep the bees alive throughout the winter, especially with the open air colonies. A lot of bees, especially in certain areas with forests or trees, are these tree cavities. So, certain trees have, openings where the bees can fly in and then form homes within these tree cavities. And so if you cut these up, they'll typically have, wax inside of them, the queen actively laying. And so basically a full colony that's unmanaged inside a tree cavity. And then they can live in structures, so in walls or roofs or sheds. And this was a beekeeper that found a bee living in one of their walls. You see these huge wax comb built, and you see the brood right in the middle. And so bees can live in a lot of different areas, and as long as they're protected from the environment, as long as they have opening to come in and out, bees can live practically anywhere. So one thing that we have done as beekeepers is to really understand these kind of natural or native nesting sites and use that to make some of these man-made colonies. And so it's really important to understand some of these nesting preferences, to understand how bees live and understand how we can develop better colonies to better suit the bees. And so one thing that bees do, especially in unmanaged environments, is they try to find a nesting location that's protected from the environment. So bees want to avoid, strong winds. They want the colony to avoid direct sunlight and also heavy rain. And so, for example, if you had a house and you had a hole in your roof and rain's coming in, that's really undesirable for your family. And same with the thing with the bees. They don't want any rain or wind or environment coming into their home. And so they want to find a nice home that's protected from all these environmental factors that can impact their growth and survival. They also prefer enclosed cavities with small entrances. And so they don't want the entrance too big because if it's too big, then it's harder for them to regulate temperature, humidity inside the colony, but they want it too small because that can cause overheating within the colony. So it's really important to have a certain size entrance so the bees can come in and out. In some situations, if bees build a home, they'll start building that entrance smaller with propolis to make sure it's a smaller entrance. So bees are really good at regulating the entrance size. The cavity size is also really important. So, bees prefer a nest size of 20 to 100 liters, but the average is 40 liters, which is very similar to what a Langstroth colony is. And so they prefer something, between this number. But like I mentioned, if it's too small, that can cause, overheating, that can cause a lack of storage and lack of the colony to actually grow. But if it's too big, it's harder for the bees to regulate the temperature and make sure the colony is exposed to all these environmental factors. So they want to make sure that the colony is around 40 liters. And so as beekeepers, one thing we've really studied from these natural nests is the bee space. And so the bee space is how far apart the wax comb actually is. If it's too close together, then the bees are unable to move in and out between the two and take care of the developing larvae or add in the resources. If it's too wide, then it's tough for the bees to regulate the temperature and they start building burr comb to close out the space. And so as beekeepers, we've looked at this bee space, which is around 3/8 of an inch, and designed removable frames to target that bee space. And one thing we looked at is adjustable entrances. So, with these Langstroth colonies that we typically manage as beekeepers, these entrances aren't too big, but they're also not too small. But we also have the capacity to close that entrance so it's smaller going into the winter and smaller to protect the nest if possible. So this example of a bee space. So like I mentioned, we have removable frames, typically 10 frames per colony if you run 10 frame equipment. And the bee space is about 3/8 of an inch. And so the bee space ranges from 1/4 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch. If it's less than 1/4 of an inch, then the bees are unable to move or navigate in between the frames. If it's more than that, you start seeing a lot of comb built up between the two frames. So the bees like space that's less than 3/8 of an inch. And that's one reason if you're inspecting your colonies or removable frames, making sure that the frames are as close together as possible so you're not impeding on that bee space and causing the bees to, maybe produce burr comb in between the frames. So these are the three major brood cell types. So brood just means developing bees. And so we have the worker cells. So the workers are developing in the standard hexagonal cells. And so as you can see, these are all workers, developing workers. We have the smaller instars to the larger workers. We have the queen cells. So queen cells are the largest type of brood cell. You can see that they're quite a bit larger than the standard hexagonal worker cells, and that allows the queen to grow, get larger ovaries, and have the capacity to lay, thousands of eggs per day. And then we have the drone cells. So drone cells are their size is in between a worker cell and a queen cell. And so you can see that this is a drone cell surrounded by worker cells. It's a little bit larger because the drone does get larger and they need to develop the sperm for these mating flights. Okay, so colonies go through these different stages throughout a season, and I won't talk about this too much. I talk about this a lot during the apprentice level, during inspections, because it's really important to know what stage the bees are and type of management you need to be doing at those different stages. And so I like to split a bee year into these four major stages. So stage one, and I really just focus on the red line for now. This is the colony growth line, but these are different diseases or viral populations and how they grow throughout a season. But stage one is really the dormancy stage. So we're currently in that stage one. We'll be kind of leaving stage one and stage two here pretty soon. But stage one just means the bees are forming these clusters, forming these kind of, warm spinning balls to keep them warm throughout the winter and survive throughout the winter. Because unlike a lot of the other bees and native bee species, they don't go through hibernation or diapause. Bees are kind of forming these perennial colonies throughout a year, and they're using honey to keep them warm throughout the year. So currently the bees are kind of in this dormancy phase, but if you have looked at your colonies recently, they might have started brooding up. So some of them might be in the colony growth stage. So stage two is what I like to call the colony growth stage. So this is when your queens start laying eggs, your colonies start brooding up, and your colony size begins growing. Because throughout the winter, the colony wants to stay really small, because if it's too big, it'll run through the resources really quickly. So colonies are smaller going through the winter. But as we enter stage two, which is right around now, the queens will start laying eggs, the colony will start getting bigger, and then it'll start getting to stage three, which is when the colony reaches its maximum size. So stage three is typically in July or August. This is when your bees reach its maximum size, and this is when your colonies aren't going to grow much longer. This is also when, you've probably produced most of the honey and maybe started harvesting honey. And so stage three is kind of the end of the bee year, really. After that, after August, you may be producing a little bit of honey depending on your region. So there is some late fall flows, but typically the majority of honey production is occurring at stage two and stage three. Now, what's happening at stage three to stage four is your colonies beginning to decrease and prepare for the winter. So that means is your summer bees are converting to winter bees to live longer. Your colonies trying to hoard as much honey as possible to make it through the winter, and they're trying to get their populations down so they're not too big going into the winter. And so stage three is going from that population decrease into that dormancy phase. Okay, so next we'll talk about, honeybee development. So honeybees are holometabolists, and what that means is they convert from a larva or grub-like stage, transform their entire body through metamorphosis into what we like to see as a worker bee. And so, honeybees start in these kind of larval stage. And so they look like little grubs, and they're basically this giant digestive tissues. And their only role is to eat as much as possible and grow as fast as they can because they want to grow to what a worker size is, and then kind of stay at that size to develop into a future worker, queen, or drone. And so these are basically just, feeding machines that grow as fast as they can. Now, honeybee larvae go through 5 larval instars. An instar just means a molt. So after bees pass from one instar to the next, they're molting to the next stage. And so you can't really tell the difference. You can't tell where the molts are because they're basically invisible to the human eye. But these bees are molting as they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, each instar lasts about 1 day. So, 1 day larva is the same as a first instar larva. A 2-day old larva is the same as a two instar larva, and so on. So, larvae go through about 5 instars or 5 molting events. Here is an egg. An egg hatches after 3 days and hatches into the first larval instar. After 1 day, it molts into the second larval instar. So this is what the second instar looks like. The third instar is a little bit bigger, so you can start seeing it with the naked eye. The fourth instar is a little bit bigger. And then when you start seeing the really large larvae that are almost overflowing into cells, these are what I like to call the fifth larval instar. And so, as beekeepers, and you guys all probably have a few years of beekeeping experience at least, you can probably tell what a first instar larva and an egg look like. But the new beekeepers, it may be hard to distinguish these. After they pass this fifth larval instar, they actually start spinning cocoon and then going through metamorphosis into the pupa stage and then into the adult stage. So this caproot includes, larva that's actually spinning cocoon and going through metamorphosis into the pupa stages. So these are the different, larvae and pupa that are underneath the cell cappings. And so this is the prepupa. So this is the larvae that are going from this kind of C shape into this upright state. And you actually can't see it here with the naked eye, but they actually have a cocoon spun all the way around this because they're spinning cocoon and they're going through metamorphosis to transition from a larva into a pupa. Once they go through metamorphosis, you can start seeing the full bee body. So you can see the head, you can see the thorax, you can see the abdomen. You can also start seeing the legs and the antenna from the pupa. Now the pupa, they start as this white-eyed stage. So this is when their skin's really tender, and this is when they can be damaged really easily. And so at this time, their skin's actually hardening into that hard exoskeleton the bees need to survive once they become adults. So over time, their skin starts hardening and melanizing. Their eyes start changing color into a pink-eyed, purple-eyed stage. And what this basically means is those organs are developing, their skin and exoskeleton is developing and hardening, and their eyes are changing color to be ready to navigate in the outside environment. And so the development changes based on a worker versus a queen. So workers take 21 days to get from an egg to an adult stage. Drones take 24 days, and queens take 60 days. So queens develop really quickly compared to the other casts. Okay, so next I'll talk about queens a little bit. Queens are really important. Most of you have had bees for, at least a couple years, so you understand how important it is to have queens. And maybe you experienced some queen failure issues or queen quality issues. So it's really important to know the queen's role and how to maintain higher quality queens. And if something happens to the queens, what to do about requeening and replacing those queens. So why are honeybee queens important? So I think we think about, honeybee colony, we always think about the queen. And one reason we think about queens is because they're important for egg laying and sustaining colony growth and colony reproduction. And so their major role is colony genetics. And so 50% of the genetics within a colony are coming from the queens because they're laying all the eggs within a colony. And so we think about, these genetics, we think about all these different traits that come with it. So if you buy certain, breeding lines, they can be more docile or more aggressive. If you buy certain queen lines, it can be, more mite resistant or less mite resistant. So these queens are really important because they're providing the genetics and provide all these important traits that you as a beekeeper are looking for. Number two is this egg laying. So queens, because they have these two large ovaries, have the capacity to lay somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day. And so they're laying a lot of eggs, sustaining colony growth and sustaining colony size. And so the queen's most important role is to not only provide genetics, but this egg laying capacity. Third is their ability to store sperm. So I'll talk about the mating behavior for queens a little bit, but queens during their early lifespan, they go on these multiple mating flights, mate with multiple males, and then store that sperm in a sperm storage called the spermatheca. Once they store all that sperm, the queens will typically never leave the colony again, and they need to store that sperm for at least 1 to 4 years to lay consistently 2,000 eggs per day for about 2 to 4 years. And so the queen needs to basically keep that sperm alive for multiple years so they can continue to lay those unfertilized eggs. So the sperm storage is important for queens to not only collect the sperm from the males, but also store the sperm and keep them alive for 4 years. And then colony traits, I talked about that a little bit with genetics. So genetics and traits go hand in hand. If the queen has better genetics, they have more of the desirable traits that you're looking for as a beekeeper. So this include honey yield, resistance to varroa, resistance to viruses, and so on. So a lot of the traits that we see as beekeepers are directly coming from the queen. And then pheromones. So queens produce very important pheromones for the colony. One pheromone is this QMP or queen mandibular pheromone. This pheromone basically tells the workers that there's an active laying queen in the colony and that the queen is really high quality. And if that pheromone diminishes, that tells the workers that they need to replace the queen and supersede the queen. So these pheromones, especially the QMP pheromone, is really important for queen quality. Now, one thing we see is young queens produce more of this QMP pheromone, but as they get older in age and lose their egg laying capacity, this pheromone diminishes, and that tells the workers that they need to supersede and usurp the queen. Other pheromones, so queens produce other pheromones that basically tell the rest of the workers that there's a queen inside the colony, so it maintains the colony cohesion. They also produce certain pheromones that tell the bees that they need to collect more pollen and nectar. And so as the queen begins to start laying more eggs and ramp up brood production, they produce more pheromones that tell the rest of the bees to collect more pollen and nectar for the new developing brood. So the queens are really important with their pheromones to not regulate the queen, but also regulate some of the foraging activities of the workers. So the typical life cycle of a queen could be upwards to 1 to 4 years. And so that includes from egg all the way to when a queen either dies or is replaced by the colony. And so, some of you may have had bees for multiple years now, and I'd say the average lifespan for a queen now is maybe a year to a year and a half. I don't see many queens reaching those 2 year marks, but there are some reports where queens can live, 4 years, even upwards to 7 years. And so queens can live a really long time, but we're seeing that queens just aren't living as long as they used to. But let's start at the development. So, queens from egg all the way to larva or to adult take about 16 days. So that's quite a bit shorter and faster than a worker, which takes 21 days, and a drone, which takes 24 days. Now, what's really important for this stage is one, the queens are growing really large, so they're growing larger than the queens. or the workers, but they're also developing specialization for reproduction, egg laying, and pheromones. And so what they're doing is they're developing really large ovaries to give them the ability to lay 2,000 eggs per day if needed. They're also developing a specialized sperm storage organ called spermatheca so they can mate with drones and store the sperm to lay fertilized eggs throughout a year. And so it's really important for the specialized reproduction during these 16 days. And so if you're, we will talk about queen rearing and queen breeding a little bit later in this section, but it's really important to know these 16 days because it really sucks to, raise a bunch of queens and one queen emerges early and kills the rest of the queens. So understand these 16 days will be really important if you do begin raising your own queens. After the queens emerge as an adult, for the first week or 10 days, queens will go on multiple mating flights. And so these unmated queens will fly out of the colony, go to these mating areas known as drone congregation areas, and mate with somewhere between 15 to 20 males or drones. Now, there's some reports that, queens can mate with, 50 drones at a time, but on average, especially for Texas queens, they're mating with maybe 15 to 20 males during these multiple mating flights. And so they'll mate with these males, and then they'll store the sperm in the spermatheca, and then after that, the queen will rarely, rarely ever leave the colony ever again because they have the sperm that they need, they have the ability to lay eggs, and so they can lay multiple eggs or thousands of eggs per day. So once they mate and they store that sperm, the queens will just lay eggs for really the next 1 to 4 years. Okay, so queen development. So like I said, they trans bees, all bees, whether you're a queen or a worker, transition from a larva stage to a pupa stage. And so the larva is basically these kind of eating bodies, these feeding tubes that allow the bees to grow as fast as they can. And then they go through metamorphosis and transition to what we like to see as a bee. Now, during the larval stage, this is when the ovaries are developing in the queens. So because the workers are receiving different nutrients, their ovaries aren't developing, aren't getting as large, and they're becoming shriveled compared to a queen. And so because the queen are receiving certain nutrients during development, they're growing these really large organs, and these organs for sperm storage. And so this larval development is really important for the queen. So if anything happens during this stage, maybe like mites feeding on them or diseases or viruses, this can directly impact the queen fertility, their ovary development, and their ability to, lay eggs once they become an adult. Okay, so honeybees have this system known as caste determination. And so what that means is when a queen lays a fertilized egg, so that means that they're fertilizing the egg with the sperm from the drones, these fertilized eggs can either become a reproductive queen or a non-reproductive worker. So these fertilized eggs take about 3 days to hatch, and then once they become an early larval instar, the workers will determine whether that larva will become a queen or a worker. And one way they regulate that is through the size of the cell. And so 99% of the time, especially if you already have an active laying queen in your colony, all these unfertilized eggs and larvae that are results of unfertilized eggs will become workers. These are raised in these small worker cells. But if a colony needs to replace their queen because it's failing, or in a situation where your queen dies, or there's a swarming event, the bees will raise these really large peanut-shaped queen cells and provide those larvae more food, and those workers or those larvae will develop into queens rather than workers. So really the only difference between what's fed to queens and workers is they're raised in larger cells, so they receive more food during development. So when we think about what's fed to developing workers or to queens, we like to call it royal jelly. It's all I think a lot of people think that royal jelly is only fed to queens and worker jelly is only fed to workers, but really royal jelly and worker jelly are pretty much the same. The royal jelly, which is fed to queens, does have more proteins and less sugars. The royal jelly fed to workers has less proteins and more sugars. And so there's a quality difference, but really the major difference is those cells are quite a bit larger, 10 times larger than a worker cell. So the bees are feeding them 2 to 3 times more food than a workers. And because the queens are developing more food, those larvae can get bigger, those ovaries can get bigger, and that allows those larvae to become queens rather than workers. Now, what's in royal jelly? It's basically like a milk that the bees produce. So it contains all the nutrients that bees need to develop and grow into an adult. And so they have these proteins. So about 6 different proteins in royal jelly that's important for growth and development. They have a lot of different sugars that allow um, for metabolism and growth. They have water, they have lipids and fats, and then a lot of important micronutrients such as vitamins, minerals, and even antioxidants. So royal jelly is basically a catch-all for all these important nutrients that the bees need to grow and develop. And this is a picture of a queen cell that I opened up. As you can see, this really small larva is sitting in this huge pool of royal jelly. And over time, the larva will eat most of that royal jelly. And that's allowing that larva to grow really big into a queen rather than a worker. So really the only difference is the workers are restricting the food that the workers get versus the queens are getting an abundance of food. Okay, so the queen anatomy, just kind of walk you through this. We are developing on a new graphic. This is a really great graphic, but we're hoping to get a better, higher quality graphic for this. But in the queen, they have these two large ovaries in this yellow. And with these ovaries are these spiracles. So you can see these lines going through the ovaries. These are known as ovarials. So there's about 100 to 200 ovarials per ovary. And these ovarials are the ones that are actually producing the eggs and developing the eggs. And so as queens are developing eggs, they're developing these ovarials. These eggs are developing, travel down the ovaries, and then go into the oviduct. As the eggs are traveling through the oviduct, they stop at the spermatheca. Now, the queen has a valve on that spermatheca, and that allows the queen to control whether that egg is fertilized or not fertilized. Now, remember, all fertilized eggs become a female, so either a worker or a queen. But if it's unfertilized, that individual becomes a male or a drone. And so if a queen wants to lay a drone, they basically shut that valve so that sperm can't fertilize that egg. But if a queen wants to lay either a worker or a future queen, the queen opens up that valve and that allows that egg to become fertilized. So the spermatheca is extremely important for fertilization and developing the sexes for the workers. Once that egg passes through the spermatheca, it travels through the rest of the oviduct and then it's laid. Now, as you can see, um, the digestion tract or intestinal tract is right next to the ovaries. It actually travels in between the two ovaries. So if you ever dissect a queen, you'll see the digestive tract is right next to the ovaries, and they're actually expelling waste at the same site where they lay eggs. They also have a stinger, same as a worker, but the stingers aren't barbed for queens. So what that means is when a queen stings you, they don't automatically die after stinging. And it's actually really rare for you to get stung by a queen. I've only been stung by a queen a few times, so it's really rare, and the queen doesn't die after stinging you. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit more about queen mating. So in the beginning, for the first, week to 10 days, queens will go on multiple mating flight to these areas known as drone congregation areas. There can be upwards to 1,000 to even 20,000 males at these DCAs or mating sites. And so when a queen arrives, these drones will form these kind of massive drone comets and chase after the queen. One of the drones will latch onto the queens, inseminate the queen, and then she'll store that in the spermatheca or sperm storage organ. Then she'll, after she's done with mating with that one male, she'll go back and mate with multiple males. And so she may go on maybe one, maybe 7 mating flights. It really depends on the weather and different conditions. But most queens will mate with, on average, 12 to 20 males. But there's been some reports saying upwards of 50 males at a time, but that's extremely rare. So here's a video of a queen mating flight. Yeah, so this is a really old video from Switzerland. So you see the queen flying out. And you see all these bees right here. These are all drones. So they're forming this drone comet. And they chase after the queen. And as you imagine, there's 1,000 to 2,000 drones chase after one queen. So it's extremely competitive. So they're actually knocking each other out of the way. Now, one of these drones is faster and latches onto the queen to mate with the queen. So the drones latch onto the queen and then starts inseminating the queen, so passing sperm. They become paralyzed in the air and then drop, you know, 5 to 10 feet down. After the insemination process is over, the drone's reproductive tract is ripped out, and the drone dies, and the queen will go on and then mate with more drones. And so that gives a really great summary about the mating behavior of queens and drones. I'm hoping to make a newer, better video, but this is a really great illustration of what it actually looks like. And so if you want to look at this video a bit more, there's a lot of videos on YouTube, but this one's called The Queen and Honeybee's Wedding Flight. I think it's one of the better ones. I think the full version is maybe 20 minutes, but it gives you sort of a short snippet of what this mating behavior, mating flight looks like. Okay, so what does the honeybee queen mating number look like? So it can depend on a lot of different things. So, once we get into the queen rearing section, we'll talk about this a bit more, but the mating number really depends on a lot of different factors. And so if the weather's really poor when your queen's going out on these mating flights, they will delay their mating flights until the weather's better. But if it's really windy or rainy, the queen might not be able to find the drones and mate with as many drones. So weather can play a really important role. So if you start, producing queens in, mid-February to early March, your mating quality may not be as high because the weather's, really variable, especially here in Texas. And so I'd say that your colonies are producing the most males and the weathers are ideal probably in, late March, early April, but it really depends. It can change a lot. Pathogens make a really big difference. So there's been a lot of research done at Dr. Juliana Rangel's lab in Texas A&M with Liz Walsh, where they show that if the queen is exposed to pathogens or any insecticides, that the queens actually mate more. And that might be one way for them to combat some of these diseases and insecticides. Parasites can make a really big difference. So it's very rare to see like mites, row mites, for example, in a queen cell. I've seen it before in really infested colonies. And if the mites are actually feeding on the fat body of the queen, that can impact her ovary development and impact her egg laying capacity. Nutrition plays a really important role. So if you're raising your own queens, making sure that your colony has a lot of protein supplements and it has all the resources it needs to produce new queens and produce high brood. So if your nutrition is really low, your queens will be smaller, her spermatheca will be smaller, so she can mate with less drones, and her ovaries will be smaller. So nutrition plays a really important role during queen development. And then viruicides or miticides. So, these treatments that you use to apply to treat for mites can directly impact the queens. So mating number depends on a lot of different things. So egg laying. So this is how the anatomy of a queen actually looks like. So this is the ovaries. Because you see most of her abdomen is taken up by these two large ovaries. The oviduct is where the egg is passing from the ovaries to the oviduct, and then the spermatheca is what's fertilizing the eggs. And so, if you are producing some queens and want to see if your queens are mated or not, I mean, I wouldn't advise it, but if you have a queen that's failing and you're replacing her anyways, you can actually easily pull out the spermatheca, which is where the sperm is stored, and see how well mated that queen actually is. So this is an example from a mated queen. So you see the spermatheca is this kind of round white ball. And it's white because there's a lot of sperm stored in the spermatheca. And for a queen, they can store I'd say maybe 1 million to 6 million sperm cells. So they store a lot of sperm cells in these spermatheca. This is spermatheca from an unmated queen. So you can see it's kind of this clear crystal ball because the queen hasn't gone on those mating flights and hasn't stored that sperm yet in the spermatheca. But when the queen's well mated and has a lot of healthy, viable sperm stored in the spermatheca, a queen can lay, 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per day, even more in some cases. Okay, so how do you spot a high quality queen? The first thing to look at is the brood pattern. Now, we'll say that just because you have a poor brood pattern doesn't necessarily mean you have a poor queen. Brood pattern can be shaped by a lot of different things. So, if the workers are storing a lot of pollen and nectar, so the queen can't lay there, you might see a spotted brood pattern. Or if there's some disease that can impact the brood pattern. So, brood pattern is just one metric to look at whether you have a healthy or unhealthy queen. But if you know what signs you're looking for, it can be a reliable predictor. So as a beekeeper, this is the type of brood pattern we're looking for. So as you can see, it's very solid. There's a few empty spots, so the queen's missing a few spots, but in general, this is a very solid brood pattern. And so I typically rate my brood pattern from a scale from 1 to 5, and 5 being the best. And I would give a 5 for sure. This is a really solid brood pattern, and to me, this looks like a really great queen. Now, this is a sign of a failing queen. Now, one reason that this is a sign of a failing queen is because one, it's extremely spotty brood pattern. So you can see that the queen's missing a lot of open spots. But two, you can see a lot of drone cells in the middle next to the worker cells. So what this means is the queen's laying fertilized eggs, which are becoming workers, but they're also laying a lot of drones in the middle of the brood boxes. So that means is that the queen's running out of sperm or that sperm is dying, and so she's laying a mixture of workers and drones. Now, all colonies are raising drones, and so even if you have a healthy, really high quality queen, you will see some drones. But if you see a lot of workers and drones mixed together like this pattern on the middle of a brood frame, that's a sign that your queen's failing and should be replaced. One way to also check is the health of the queen. So you don't always have to find the queen. If I find eggs and it seems like the queen's doing really well and there's a good brood pattern, I never make my time to find the queen. But if you do see signs like this, where it's a very poor brood pattern and the queen's laying a lot of drone eggs next to worker cells, then I do try to find the queen to see how she's looking. Now, this example, what a healthy, high quality queen looks like. So you can see the wings are fully intact. She's a healthy looking queen. The wings aren't tattered at all. But this is a sign of a failing queen. So you can see that this one wing is totally chewed off. So half the wings are already chewed off by the workers. And even this wing is tattered a little bit. And this is actually the queen from this cell. So I saw that she had a spotty brood pattern, but she also has these wings tattered. And I don't have a video of this, but the bees were actually chewing at her wings and chewing at her. So the bees were actively trying to replace that queen. And so if you start seeing a spotted brood pattern like that, and you see tattered wings on your queen, that's a sign that she's getting old and starting to fail, and the workers know that and are trying to replace her. Next thing to look at is the retinue. So it's one of these metrics, not always the best metric because, as new beekeepers, you may oversmoke the colonies, and that causes the queen and the bees to disperse. And so if you oversmoke the colonies, you might not see a clear retinue. But if you apply just a little bit of smoke and your bees aren't running everywhere, for a high quality queen, you'll see a clear retinue or attendance of workers surrounding the queen. And so typically there's 5 to 10 attendees in this retinue. They're kind of grooming her, they're cleaning her, they're feeding her, and they're taking care of her. So the workers are making sure that she's taken care of because they know that she's a good, high quality queen. But in this situation, this is a failing queen. Her wings are tattered. She has a very spotty brood pattern, and the bees aren't surrounding her or taking care of her. And so this is a sign that this queen's starting to fail, and there's some issues with this queen. And next is queen cells. So if you start seeing any queen cells, this can mean a lot of different things. And so as a beekeeper, it's extremely important to know what these different queen cells mean because queen cells can mean a lot of different things. And so as bee detectives, you need to understand one, that there's queen cells in the colony, but what do those queen cells actually mean? And so one type of queen cell are these emergency queen cells. So in this situation, the beekeeper accidentally killed the queen, and so the bees are actively trying to raise queens as fast as they can. And so you'll see maybe 10 or 20 of these emergency queen cells in the face of the comb. And they're typically a lot smaller because the queens are in this kind of emergency mode where they're trying to raise queens as fast as possible. Because once the larvae get too old, those larvae can't become queens again. So they're frantically trying to raise as many queen cells as possible because if they don't raise a queen, then that colony risks becoming queenless or hopelessly queenless. Supersedure cells, this is when there's a situation of a failing queen with a spotty brood pattern and the workers know it. So they start raising these supersedure cells to try to raise a new queen and usurp or replace that old failing queen. And so you won't see as many of these cells as emergency queen cells. You maybe see somewhere between 2 to 5 of these supersedure cells. One way to tell them apart is there's less of them. Two, they're also quite a bit bigger. And three, there's still a queen inside the colony. Whereas emergency cells, there won't be a queen in the colony. And then swarm cells. So this is a situation where there's not enough space for the colonies to store resources for the queen to lay egg. And so in that situation, half the colonies and the old queen is flying off to build a new nest. And so if you see a lot of these queen cells at the bottom of the frame, that's a sign that your colony is about to swarm. If they're open like this, well, that's a sign that your colony has swarmed or is about to swarm. So, if you start seeing these open queen cells on the bottom of the frame, that's a sign of some sort of swarming behavior. Okay, another thing is looking at brood diseases. And so as queens get older and as their pheromones get less, not only does the colony size begin to decrease, but the colony is really stressed out. And because they're stressed out, just like any human, right? When we're stressed out, we're more likely to get some of these diseases. Same with a colony. When they're really stressed out from a failing queen, they're more likely to get some of these brood diseases. And so this is a really healthy colony. You can see they have these C-shaped larvae. They're kind of white pearly colored. It's a very solid brood pattern. So it's a sign of a really healthy colony, a healthy queen with not a lot of diseases. But this is a colony with disease larvae, so European foul brood. So this colony was really stressed out. The queen's starting to fail, the colony's starting to decline, and we start seeing more of these European foul brood diseases. And so, but also you might see these because the queen might not have the right genetics. And so some queens are more susceptible and some queens are less susceptible. And it really depends on the genetics of the queen. And so in this situation, I'd probably replace the queen with a more hygienic queen. Okay, so next we'll talk about honeybee drones. So drones are the males within the colony. And the colony only produces males when there's enough resources to invest into, reproduction or males. So if you think about a honeybee colony, right, there's somewhere between 1,000 to maybe 10,000 bees. And the colony's goal is to grow and then survive. Now, once the colony has enough resources to grow and survive, they begin investing into basically these kind of flying sperm machines called drones. And so when you have a heavy pollen flow or heavy nectar flow, the colony begins producing drones to pass on genetics to future queens and future colonies. And so the only situation where your colonies begin producing drones is when there's a lot of pollen coming into your colony and a lot of nectar available. And so that's why we only see drones being produced probably the next month or so into the early summertime. Now, why are drones important? I think as beekeepers, we forget about the drones because they don't really do any tasks within the colony. They're not laying eggs, they're not foraging, they're not defending the colony, they're not nursing. They're basically mooching out the workers for nutrition and temperature warmth from the workers. But they're really important because one, they contribute half the genetics to future queens. So I talked about half the genetics coming from the queen. The other half are coming from these 15 to 20 males that the queen's mating with. So the genetics are coming from the drones, and a lot of these traits are directly influenced by the drones. Two is their sperm production. So honeybee males are really great at producing a lot and high quality sperm. So, drones can keep sperm alive at about 90%, whereas, bumblebee males, for example, can only keep sperm alive at about 50%. So honeybee males are really great at producing a lot of sperm and a high quality sperm. But it's also really important to have the high quality sperm for the queen so she can store that sperm for 2 to 4 years. Because if the drone's producing really crappy sperm, then that queen won't be able to lay fertilized eggs for 2 to 4 years. And that directly ties into queen quality. So when we think about a failing queen or high quality queen, we always kind of focus on the queen because it's probably a queen issue, but a lot of times it's directly related and directly correlated to the drone. So the queen isn't mating with as many high quality drones, or she's not storing enough high quality sperm that can directly impact the queen quality and her egg laying capacity. And then finally, colony traits. So this is directly tied to genetics. And so, as beekeepers, we're interested in honey production. We're interested in row resistance. We're interested in disease resistance. And a lot of these genetics are coming from the males. And so the genetics and these traits are directly influenced by the males that the queen's mating with. So when you think about why drones are important, the number one reason is they contribute to queen failure. So one thing we're seeing as research community is these queens are failing at a high clip, where queens are failing within 6 months, where they should be reproducing and laying eggs for 2 to 4 years. And a lot of research has been focused on the queens, but we're starting to see that drones are playing a really important role for queen quality and eventual queen failure. And one reason for that is because if the queens are mating with low quality males, they won't be able to store that sperm for long periods of time and won't be able to lay eggs for the 2 to 4 years that they need to. And so this was a really cool study done by Dr. Jeffrey Pettis in the Beltsville Bee Lab in Beltsville, Maryland. And so in 2016, he started hearing reports of queen failure from beekeepers across the country. And so what he did was he collected failing queens on the East Coast, failing queens on the West Coast, and he compared those to the queens that he raised in Beltsville, Maryland. And so what he did was he pulled out the spermatheca or the sperm storage organ and measured what percentage of that sperm that was stored by the queen was alive versus dead. Now, honeybee queens are remarkable in that they can store sperm at 90% alive for multiple years. So queens are really great about that. If you actually compare it to bumblebee queens or wasp queens, they can only store sperm at about 50% alive. So honeybee queens are really great about storing that sperm. And so one thing they expected was the queen should be storing sperm that's about 90% alive, which is right around here. But we saw that queens that were filling in the East Coast and the West Coast, they're only storing sperm that's about 50% alive. So 50% of the sperm that the queen was storing was actually dead. Now, this could be a queen issue in that the queen isn't storing that sperm and unable to keep that sperm alive for multiple years, but this could be a drone issue. So maybe she's mating with lower quality drones that's producing lower quality sperm. And so this is all to say that if your queen's having issues or queen's starting to fail, it could be a queen issue, but it could be the males that your queen's actually mating with. Second is drones contribute to colony success and genetics. So, 50% of the genetics within a colony come from the males. And so within a colony, you have about 15 to 20 subfamilies because the queen's mating with 15 to 20 males. And so you have these kind of subfamilies within a colony, but they're really important for all these different traits that we are interested in as a beekeeper. So, we're interested in mite resistance. So we think about VSH and hygienic behavior and all these different mite resistant grooming traits. These are directly influenced by the males. And we'll talk about this a little bit more during the breeding section, but a lot of these traits are directly coming from the males. And so if you are raising queens, it's really important to know where the males are coming from. So if you get into insemination and control the breeding, that's one way to select for some of these traits. Virus resistance, we're learning that a lot of this virus resistance is coming from the males. And so we're doing some assays to, measure virus resistance and tolerance. And we're seeing that the males play a really important role for that. But even productivity in different landscapes. So Texas is a big state. There's a lot of different ecoregions in Texas. And so your colony's productivity in West Texas versus East Texas could be directly influenced by not only the queens, but also the males she's mating with. And so that's why we always talk about these locally adapted stocks, where certain stocks may perform better in your region because they're selected and bred for those different landscapes and environments. And then just general colony performance. But this is all to say that drones are important for not only the queens, but also colony success. So what makes a successful drone? So, unlike queens, which take about 2 to 4 years until they die, drones take about 54 days. So quite a bit shorter than queens. So drones take about 24 days to develop from an unfertilized egg into an adult drone. But this point is really important because this is when the drone's actually producing sperm. So the drones only produce sperm during a short 2 to 3 day window during drone development. After that point, drones can never produce sperm ever again. So even if you see an adult drone in your colony, all their sperm is produced during development, and they're not actively producing sperm once they're an adult. And that's different from any other closely related bees. Number two is their sexual maturity. So what's different for a drone is their sperm is migrating from the sperm storage organ, the testes, into the seminal vesicles. And then once that sperm is in the seminal vesicles, that allows that sperm to be inseminated into the queen. And so for the first 10 days, the drones are in the middle of the brood box, taken care of the workers, and the workers are helping that sperm migrate from the testes to the seminal vesicles so it can be, seminated and passed to the spermatheca of the queen. Once the drones reach sexual maturity and the sperm is migrated, the drones go on these multiple mating flights. So they go to these mating areas where they kind of wait there for a queen to arrive. Once a queen arrives, they form massive drone comets, chase after the queen, and one lucky drone might mate with a queen. But like I mentioned, these areas can have somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 drones competing for maybe one or a few queens. So it's an extremely competitive environment for these males. And then after 54 days, typically males die. I've seen some live for 74 to 80 days, but typically 54 days is kind of the last mark for drones. So they either, mate or they die trying. So briefly touch about sperm production during development. So, honeybees are whole metabolists, right? So they're transitioning from a larval stage to a pupa stage. During this larval stage, this is extremely important for sperm production and sperm development. So during this fifth instar, or the fifth day old larva, this is the first stage of sperm production called spermatogenesis number one. So this is the first stage when drones actually produce sperm. Once they get upright, spin a cocoon and are capped, so they're in this pre-pupa stage. This is the second stage of sperm production called spermatogenesis number two. So these are only two stages or days when drones can actually produce sperm. After that, they can never produce sperm ever again. And I just want to touch on this a little bit more, and I know we will touch on this more during the mating biology section. But what's important about this is there's a lot of things that can influence drones and cause them to be sterile or infertile. So, for example, rural mites love drones. They develop longer, they have larger fat bodies, and so mites love drones. And so a lot of times when you have, drone frames or you open up drone cells, you'll see a lot of mites feeding on the fat body of drones. Now, that's an issue because if the mites are feeding on the fat body of drones, they could be damaging the sperm production, they could be transmitting deadly viruses, and that can cause irreparable damage to the drones. And so mites, especially during drone production, is really important to control them because if you don't, that can impact their sperm quality and sperm production. But even treatments like mite treatments, if you're applying mite treatments during drone development, that can impact them. If there's pesticides around, I mean, a lot of things can impact drones. They're actually really sensitive during this stage. And then spermiogenesis. So basically, once they reach this purple-eyed stage, this is when the sperm tail is formed, and that's really important for sperm swimming from the drone into the spermatheca or the sperm storage organ. So just a quick kind of overview about the drone anatomy. And like I said, we'll talk about this more during the mating biology section. So this is a testes. This is where sperm is actually produced and stored. This is seminal vesicle. So the sperm actually has to be in the seminal vesicle in order for that to be inseminated into the queen. So the sperm is actually migrating from the testes to the seminal vesicle. Once it's in the seminal vesicle, it can be inseminated into the queen. We have the mucus glands, and so the drones produce a lot of really important proteins that protect the sperm. So these proteins are important for as antioxidants, so making sure that sperm remains viable. These proteins are really important for post-insemination to the queen, so they help to keep the sperm alive for longer periods of time. These proteins are really important for, feeding the sperm to keep them alive. So there's about 200 different proteins produced in these mucus glands, and they're important for a lot of different reasons. And then we have the bulb and the horns of the cornula. And so what these basically mean, these are the endophallus. So this is a part that is averted out of the drone and pushed into the oviduct of the queen. And these hooks, the horns of the cornula, are the ones that actually hook into the queen, and the bulb is actually what's going into the queen and passing sperm into the queen during insemination. And so we'll talk about this a bit more later on, but these are probably the major anatomical features of the drone that's important for insemination and passing that sperm onto the queen. So sexual maturity. So, drones spend the first 10 days once they become adults in the middle of the brood box, and they do that because they're taken care of by the workers. So the workers are feeding them, keeping them warm, and taking care of them, and helping them reach sexual maturity. And so drones are really dependent on the workers during this stage. I've actually taken a few drones and put them into the incubator, and they die within, a few hours. And so drones can't live on their own during the stage without the workers. But the one thing that the workers are doing is they're helping that drone reach sexual maturity. So they're helping that sperm physically migrate from the testes into the seminal vesicles so the drones can reach sexual maturity and successfully inseminate a queen. So this is what an immature drone looks like. So this is actually the endophallus. So this was averted out of the drone. And here are the horns right here. So this was actually locking the drone into the queen during these mating flights. And so as you see, this is an immature drone. It's clear and there's no sperm at the tip of the endophallus, whereas this is a mature drone. So you can see the brown sperm at the tip of the endophallus. And so, once your colony begins producing drones, and we'll talk about this a bit more during the mating biology section, you can actually physically pop your drones and see if they're mature or not mature. Once the drones reach maturity, then the workers are kind of like, oh, we're done taking care of you. We're done investing resources into you. So they kick them out to the outskirts of the colony where the honey is stored because the drones are switching from a high protein diet from the workers to where the honey is stored to switch to a high sugary diet. And one reason they need this high sugar diet is because it's very energetic to fly to these mating areas, locate a queen, and mate with a queen. So they feed on this sugar to really fuel themselves on these mating flights. And so drones will fly for maybe 7 to 10 flights per day. They last somewhere between 30 to 40 minutes, and they basically fly out to these mating areas and wait for a queen to arrive. If a queen doesn't arrive, they fly back, refuel, and then go back. And so they're basically going back and forth between these mating areas. So this is some research that we're doing at Overton. So one thing we're doing is we're putting these antenna trackers on the back of the drones. And so we're hoping to do some research here this spring, seeing where drones are flying and where these mating areas are. But this is a really cool study done in Puerto Rico. And so as you can see right here, these triangles are different apiary locations where they put these tracking devices on the back of the drones. And these blue squares are where the drones are actually physically flying or where these mating areas actually are. So even though that they were tracking drones from maybe 30 to 40 different locations, the drones were only going to maybe 4 to 5 of these different mating areas. And so it seems like drones are making a very concerted effort to go to these mating areas. And I think one reason they're doing that is because it's one easy way for the drones and queens to find themselves. And so, because this process of mating in the air and finding queens in the air can be very energetic, one way bees combat that is by flying to these very specific mating areas to really find each other. And so we're learning more about these DCAs, and we'll cover this in a lot more depth during the mating section. So, including how drones and queens find these mating areas, how far apart drones and queens will fly, the landscape cues they use, and even pheromones that the drones produce to help basically congregate more drones to one specific area. But here's some data just kind of showing you just some flight differences by different genetic lines. So, we as beekeepers are buying queens from a lot of different sources. And so I evaluated 4 different sources. And you see their age at their first flight differs. So line 1, these drones started flying when they reached 8 days, whereas lines 2 and 3 started flying at 6 days. The flights per day also differed. So some drones from line 1 were flying maybe 10 flights per day, whereas 2 is flying 8 flights per day, and then 6 flights per day for 3 and 4. So this can really change based on the genetics, but also differ based on the environment. So if it's raining outside, obviously drones won't be flying, but if it's a really nice day, it's not too hot, the drones might be flying somewhere between 6 to 10 flights per day. Okay, so next I'll briefly talk about the workers. I think we're about 15 minutes. I'll leave it open to questions. So workers' importance. So workers are the non-reproductive sexes within the colony. They perform all the important tasks within the colony other than reproduction. There are some cases where workers can lay eggs, but we won't talk about that today. Their only role is to really protect the colony, clean the colony, take care of the developing brood, and collect resources. And so workers are important from one, house cleaning. So the really young workers are the ones that are going to the cells, cleaning out any dirt or debris, and keeping the colony hygienic and clean. As they get older, they become nurse bees and they start forming very important glands in their head. And these glands are producing that jelly or that milk-like substance that they're secreting to the young developing bees. And so these nurse bees are really important for tending and taking care of the young developing brood. Then once they get a little bit older, they transition to cell builders. So these are the workers that are producing wax in their abdomens. These wax are manipulated by the mandibles or hands on their face and used to build kind of wax cells or wax cappings. Then they transition to outside tasks, so the guarding tasks. So certain bees are sitting in front of the colony, and they're one, seeing if there's any predators or anything that's disturbing their colony. But then two, if there is, they produce a very specific alarm pheromone that alerts the colony and that tells the rest of the bees to come out and defend their colony from the disturbance. And so these guard bees are really important for deterring anything and keeping their colony protected. And then finally, the oldest bees are the foragers. And so these bees are the ones that are actually leaving the colony and collecting the pollen, collecting the nectar, collecting the water, and collecting the resin. And so most bees go through all these different tasks. So as they're younger, they transition from the inside tasks, such as housekeeping, nursing, and cell building. And then once they get older, they transition to guarding and foraging. And so, yeah, I talk about this a little bit more, but it's really age dependent. So the really young bees are doing the inside tasks, such as the nursing, the housekeeping, and the building. And then once they reach about 14 to 21 days old, they're doing the guarding and the foraging behavior. And I think I have a really good graphic showing this. Yeah. So this has been some really cool research done over the past 20 years, kind of tracking these different bees. The white dot is the mean, so the average age of these different tasks, but the black line is really the range. And so there's a pretty large range for all these different tasks. And so really for the cell cleaning and capping brood, that occurs for bees that are, between, age 1 to age 10. So they're really young, newly emerged bees. Then for the ones that are, tending the brood and take care of the queens, these workers are between 5 to 12 to 13 days old. The ones that are building comb, cleaning and processing the honey. These are the kind of older workers that are around 15 to 20 days old. And then the ones that are doing outside tasks, such as ventilating the colony, the ones that are guarding, the ones that are foraging, are the ones that are between, 15 days to maybe 30 days old. And so we do have a sheet here, sort of a review of our chapter. So we'll send this to you. So all this information is on that. But this is kind of a cool overview about these different tasks and the ages that these bees are doing these different tasks. So I'll kind of briefly talk about the housekeepers. So this is a really cool video of some of the housekeepers. As you can see, some of these bees are actually going in and out of the cell, like this one right here. So this one's actually going into the cell, cleaning the cell, and preparing it for the future queen. The I guess you can say the queen's really OCD. She won't lay an egg in a dirty, debris-filled cell, and so that has to be cleaned and processed by the workers before the queen will actually lay eggs. And so these housekeepers are really important for that task. And also in this video, you can see some of these bees are nursing the young developing brood and taking care of the brood. So these are the ones that are really young and doing most of the cell cleaning and the nursing behavior. These are the guard bees. And so in the front entrance, you'll have maybe 10 or 20 bees that sit in front of the colony and are basically kind of viewing the landscape and making sure that there's nothing disturbing their colony. And if there is, they produce a very specific alarm pheromone that alerts the rest of the bees to try to deter what's happening and tries to kind of push that predator or disturbance away from the colony. And so these guard bees are basically sitting outside, waiting for something to arrive and alerting the rest of the colony. And then we have the foragers. So these are the only bees that leave the colony. They're typically the oldest bees. They go out to different flower sources. They're collecting the nectar, the pollen. Some of these foragers are collecting the resin to produce into propolis, and some are collecting water to ventilate and keep hydrated. And so bees use a very specific dance to alert the bees about where these new flower sources are. So typically there's somewhere between 10 to 20 scout bees, and these scout bees are leaving the colony and finding high quality flower sources. And so these scout bees will basically kind of traverse a 2 to 3 mile radius and find new flower sources. Once they find that flower source, they'll come back to the colony and do a specific dance to tell the rest of the bees where that flower source is and where that nectar and pollen source is. And so one way they communicate this is through a dance called a waggle dance. And so based on this dance, the angle of the dance, the length of the dance, and the vigor the waggle is, that tells the bees all the information they need to know about the flower. So one, based on the angle of the flower from the sun, that tells the bees exactly where the flower is based on the sun. Based on how long this dance is, that tells the bees how the distance the flower is from the colony. And then based on how vigorous this waggle is, that tells the bees if that nectar source has higher quality sugar, for example, so more sugar than another flower source. And so what they do is they repeat this dance, and the bees will go back and follow that dance, and they'll learn that dance and learn where that flower source is. And so that's one situation where you might see one bee at a flower and come back, 2 minutes later and find hundreds of bees in the flower. It's because that one bee was coming back, doing the dance, and telling the rest of the bees where that flower source is. And so, these foraging flights can be really short. Bees don't like to travel long distances, but there's not a lot of nutrients near the apiary or near the colony. Bees will travel, 3 to 5 miles away. So here's a video of wiggle dance. see right here, this is what we like to call a dance floor. So the bees are doing the wiggle dance, doing the circle loops, and they're doing that vigorous wiggle in the middle. You see some kind of bees are kind of following, learning more about the dance, about where it is. So this bee is following this dance and learning about where that flower source is. Learn where that flower source is, and then once they do that dance and learn where that flower source is, they can go out and then find that nectar or pollen resource. Okay, so another social behavior that the bees have. So one thing about bees is they one have these individual behaviors, but they also have these social behaviors. So, bees function in these superorganism colonies where the 5 to 20,000 bees are cooperating together and working as one single colony. So a lot of them are doing these individual tasks, but they also have these social tasks that are really important for colony growth, survival, and development. So one of this is swarming, and we'll talk about swarming in a bit more in detail, but bees have the swarming behavior where there's not enough places for the colony to store nectar or pollen resources. There's not enough space for the bees to grow, and in that situation, half the workforce will fly out and find a new home. And so the workforce, works together to find a new home. And so there's a lot of different reasons for swarming. Number one is overcrowding, but number two is abundance of resources. But even certain genetic lines are more likely to swarm than other ones. So the swarming behavior I think is really fascinating, and I love learning more about it. Tom Seeley has a really great book on some of the swarming. So if you want to read more about some of his work, it talks about this in a bit more detail. But when a colony decides to swarm and they raise a new queen, the bees will be kind of flying and orienting themselves above the colony. And so a lot of situations, beekeepers get this confused with maybe robbing or other behaviors. We see a lot of bees kind of flying above the colony and they leave within, a few minutes to a few hours. That could be a good sign that your colony is actually swarming, especially if you do see queen cells within your colony. And then what they do is they go to a temporary home, typically on a tree branch. And so if you see a swarm of bees that are hanging from a tree branch, they typically won't be there for more than 2 hours, maybe, a couple weeks. They don't stay there very long. And what they're doing is they're trying to find a more permanent home. So what happens is there's about 10 scout bees that are on the back of the swarm, and they're flying out to find a more permanent home. So similar to the waggle dance and the foraging behavior, these 10 scout bees kind of traverse the whole area and they look for where a new potential home could be that's protected from the environment, that has enough space to grow, but it also has a capacity to build a new home. So these scout bees will come back and they'll do the wiggle dance about where their new home site is. But in order for that swarm to fly off and form a new permanent home, they all have to agree with one of the scout bees. And so the scout bees are basically the lobbyists. They're trying to lobby the rest of the bees to agree with them rather than their nest mates that found a different home. But in order for that swarm to fly off and find a new home, they have to reach a consensus. And so let's say 70% of the bees are, dancing with one bee, but 30% are dancing with another bee for their home. Well, in that case, they didn't reach a consensus, so they're not going to the new home. And so those bees will be kind of convincing each other, and over time, they'll reach a consensus on one wiggle dance, one home, and then eventually fly out to find a more permanent home. So once you reach a consensus and they fly off, then they form a new home, whether that's in a tree, whether that's in a structure like a wall or a shed, they form a new permanent home. I think for open air colonies, maybe a situation where they never agree to a new home, so they decide to just build an open air colony right on the branch. I'm not quite sure about that, but it's kind of weird to have open air colonies, and maybe that's one reason because the bees never agree on one wiggle dance versus the other ones. But bees are pretty precise about choosing one and agreeing on one location. One social behavior is some of these grooming behaviors. So bees have actually a pretty low immune system, and one ways they make up for that is through social immunity. And what social immunity means is the workers are working together to deal with some of the pests, pathogens, and diseases. And so one of these social immunity or social behaviors is this mite biting. And so bees can actually be bred to find mites and chew their legs off and kill the mites. And so all bees have some sort of grooming behavior, but some bees can be bred to have higher grooming behavior. And so, if you want to see if your bees have mite biting behavior, you put a sticky board and then collect the mites that fall off the sticky board and see if they have their legs chewed off. It's really time consuming, and we'll go over this a bit more during some of the breeding section, but it's one way to see if your colony does have some of these grooming behaviors. Another one is pollen. So pollen is bred for Varroa sensitive hygienic behavior, or VSH. And so what this means is there's certain task force of workers that can sense brood that actually has mites feeding on them. And so these bees actually have a very specific sense, and they find the mites into the cells, uncap them, and basically make the mites sterile or infertile. And that really inhibits and impacts the mite reproduction and mite development. And so VSH, or this hygienic behavior, is one really important way that bees, combat not only mites but some other diseases. Another one is Minnesota hygienic. So bees, like to have their colony really clean and hygienic. And we actually breed for improvements of this. And so one of this is through Minnesota hygienic testing. And so what we do here is we basically freeze 300 cells, and that kills all the brood and developing brood. We put that back into the colony, and they come back 24 hours later to see how many of those dead brood were actually removed. And so this example of extremely high hygienic colony, because about 95 to 99% of the cells were actually removed. There's only about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells that were not removed. Whereas this colony is not very hygienic. You can see about only 50% of the dead brood were removed, whereas there's still a lot of brood that's still capped and hasn't been removed by the workers. And so all bees have a little bit of hygienic behavior, but some are more hygienic than other ones. But this is one way that they're able to deal with some of these diseases that we'll talk about later on. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes here to answer any questions, but next week we'll talk about rural management and some disease management, and we'll also talk about pesticides. And so we'll have the full recording sent to you probably later today. We'll send you more information about the reading material we want you to read next week. And we also have the pre-test we'll want you to take before next week. Now, with that pre-test, just make sure you don't Google any answers. We just want to get sort of a baseline view about where you're at and so your strengths and weaknesses, just so you have a better idea about where it is in the class. And so do we have any questions? Or did you answer them all? Okay.
We've got
Perfect.
But they may have some, because some people can't check.
Okay.
Yeah, Kimberly's.
Okay, Kimberly. Yep.
Hi there. So this is very interesting, and listening to you talk about the drones particularly. I did some hive inspections this weekend, and I have 2 hives that are thriving, tight brood patterns, but they also have quite a bit of drone brood already, which I was surprised about. And interestingly enough, when I went back while you were talking and looked at my notes, one of them was a super seeder queen that mated late October or early November, which I was surprised she came back and laid. And then the second one is a queen that kind of has a little flail wing, and I don't know if that's because I rolled her during a previous inspection, or to your point, maybe they're starting to mess with her wings. So is that an indication, because they're already putting drone brood in there, that they are iffy on these 2 queens?
Yeah, so really the queen's controlling that. So maybe the queen is damaged, and so she's laying some more drones. I haven't seen any drones in our colonies yet. Maybe 1 or 2. Yeah. So I mean, some colonies are stronger and bigger, so they bring more resources, so they start producing drones. But one thing is maybe those queens are failing. So if the queen didn't mate as well in the fall, maybe they're kind of preparing to replace that queen and usurp that queen. So yeah, it's kind of tough to say, but yeah, it's interesting that your colonies are raising drones already. Because you're located in near Houston,
Huntsville.
right? Huntsville. Yep, yep.
Huntsville.
So you might have warmer climates down there versus where we are.
Okay. I'll keep an eye on those 2.
Yeah, yeah. Let me know. Send me some pictures if you have them.
Okay.
I have a question. I've had the practice of requeening every spring, but I've been kind of rethinking that and wondering if that's necessary. Should I just let the hives come up with their own new queen?
Yeah, so your question about requeening. So, one reason that beekeepers requeen every single year is because a lot of queens are filling, halfway through that second year. But if you only have a few colonies and you want your bees to raise your own queen, that's definitely one good option. One issue with having your colonies raise your queen is you don't necessarily know where your queens or drones your queens are mating with. And so, let's say your queens are mating with drones that have aggressive genetics, your colonies can be more aggressive because of that. And so I think a lot of beekeepers like to queen with known genetics from a very certified breeder because of that. But if you want to kind of raise your own queens and have your colonies raise your queens, that's definitely one option. Um, one option you could graft your own queens and then put those into the colony just so you know that they're the right age and the queen is as high quality as possible instead of just putting a frame in there. But I've seen a lot of success by just having the colony raise your own queens. So the only concern I would have is you're not sure what the genetics are or the drones that the queen's mating with, but you can always requeen again if you have to.
Put her on the spot.
Yeah, go for it, Hannah.
Okay, so I'm Hannah. I'm on the board, but I also went to Auburn in November to learn about the Tropicalaps mite, and therefore I am starting to give presentations at bee clubs. So this is like outside of the Master Beekeeper program. But while I had y'all here, I figured y'all represent a number of bee clubs. So I have put my email in the chat. And if you think that learning about the Tropicalaps mite, it's not in the US yet, but we're still trying to make people aware of it. If you think that's something that your club would benefit from, go ahead and snag my email. It's Hannah, Hannah, .blackburn, the color and what fire does, at ag.tamu.edu for those who can't see the chat. But yeah, if you think your club would benefit from me talking to them about Tropicalaps, have somebody from there contact me and I'll be happy to line something up. I'll be talking about Tropicalaps probably for the rest of my life. Um, it's my introduction into public speaking with my job, and it's scary, but if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. So I
You
figured y'all represent a number of clubs, and I would throw that out there. Thank you.
Can you talk about triple layoffs just for people that may not be familiar with it?
Okay, so just brief overview. Tropicalaps mites are about 1/3 the size of varroa mites, but they cause substantially more damage. They're native to like Southeast Asia, and so that's where they originate. They're originally from, I believe, Apis dorsata was their original host, and then they have made their way onto Apis mellifera. There are 4 species of Tropicalaps mites, but the one that we're most concerned with is Tropicalaps mercedes, and that's the one that has spread the most from that Southeast Asia area. So my talk would include some of their biology because they breed faster than Tropicalaps. Like, so they reproduce a lot faster. They don't have that period on the bee, that phoretic period, nearly to the extent that varroa does. So sampling with powdered sugar and alcohol wash, you're not going to get them in your sample unless you have a high infestation. Like there's a whole bunch of different characteristics, and I jokingly used to say they're the bigger, badder cousin of varroa, but the more I learn about them, the more I'm concerned that if they do make their way to the United States, it's going to completely change beekeeping. Completely change beekeeping. The way that Thailand beekeepers keep bees, they keep small, tiny hives. They do lots of brood breaks, things like that, because that's how they manage Tropicalaps mites. And that is not how we do beekeeping in the US. So basically, because I went to Auburn and learned about it, and I've done a few other things where I've learned about it, I've talked with a number of researchers that have been researching it. That makes me kind of the Texas spokesperson to a certain extent on tropy. Tropy is another term for Tropicalaps mites. But yeah, so that's a real short overview. But They're not in the US yet, but there is a lot of concern that they may make their way here. If you want to learn more, the Project Apis M has done some really great YouTube videos about Tropolapse mites, their biology, some of the management techniques, like and things like that. So if you just want to check them out and learn more and see if that's something your club might be interested in, because as I said, it's not in the US yet. So some people are not interested in learning about it, but we're trying to be ahead of the game because whenever Varroa was spreading, it wasn't in the US yet until it got here. And then we were completely unprepared. So we're trying to get a step ahead on the game. And part of being a step ahead is informing the beekeepers so that they know what to look for.
Yeah, and maybe we can have you talk maybe 10 minutes next week just about it since we're doing the row section, just kind of overview some of the data you have and people are interested in learning more about Tropolapse.
Yeah, I should be able to throw something together. I think, let me double check my calendar. I
And
think
and
I
if
am
if
free
not,
next
yeah.
week.
Okay. And
Oh,
if
I'm
not, no
not
worries,
free
I
next
put you on the
week.
spot. Okay.
I'm not free next week, but one of the future weeks we'll do it.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, next week I have an inspection, and that's just part of the game. Yeah, in the
Okay,
future
perfect.
I will.
Okay, perfect. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. And if there's not any questions, we will send more information. So we'll send the recording, some of the reading material for next week, and the quizzes. If you have any issues getting onto the Google Classroom, we added everybody. But if you have any issues, just shoot me or Heather an email. We're happy to help out any way possible. Okay, perfect. Well, you guys all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you guys all next Tuesday.
Nice job. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
So much.